The Institute
for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Good afternoon and welcome to a live recording of Short Circuit, the number one and probably only podcast about the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal. I'm Sheldon Gilbert, your irregular host of our slightly irreverent podcast. I'm filling in for John Ross, who's home with a bad case of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and I'm joined by our sound guru, Mark Madcow Maranta. The federal appellate courts release about 6,000 opinions a year, and over at IJ, we read them all, yes, even the ERISA ones, because you don't want to. So check out our weekly Short Circuit newsletter, where we bring you the 15 or 20 most interesting and entertaining circuit court opinions each week, and then talk about them here on this podcast. We're recording today's podcast live at Georgetown Law Center, thanks to the great folks at the Georgetown Federalist Society chapter. And we're really excited about today's episode and about our guests, the Hogan Lovells legendary appellate litigator Cate Stetson and the sage of the C.A.D.C, BYU law professor Aaron Nielson. On today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the D.C. Circuit, what makes this court unique, what it's like to litigate before the D.C. Circuit, and what are some of the big cases coming out of the court. And who better than Cate and Aaron to talk to us about the D.C. Circuit cases? So let me tell you a little bit about Cate and Aaron. Cate is co-director of Hogan's famed appellate practice group, and for good reason. She's argued over 80 cases, nearly 90 cases, before the Supreme Court, state appellate courts, and all but one of the 13 federal circuits. She's been on the front lines of some of the most important business cases of the last decade and is one of the most successful and frequent litigators in the D.C. Circuit. And she's an alum of the D.C. Circuit herself, having clerked for Judge David Tatel. Aaron Nielson is Associate Professor of Law at Brigham Young University, and he's formerly a partner and now of counsel at Kirkland & Ellis. And, of course, he's the brains behind the must-read Yale JREG blog series, D.C. Circuit Review Reviewed, which for now is the only blog series on the D.C. exclusively on the D.C. Circuit. If you want to know what's happening at the D.C. Circuit, he's your guy. Aaron clerked for Justice Alito on the Supreme Court, Judge Janice Rogers Brown on the D.C. Circuit, and for good measure, Judge Jerry Smith on the Fifth Circuit. So please give a round of applause to Cate and Aaron. It's our live studio audience. All right. As I said, we're going to kind of break this up into three different parts. In our first segment, we want to hear from Cate and Aaron a little bit about what makes the D.C. Circuit unique and some of the personalities that are on the D.C. Circuit right now. Cate and Aaron, the Supreme Court's often called the most powerful court because it gets the last word, or as Justice Jackson liked to say, the Supreme Court isn't final because it's infallible only because it's final. So my question for you is this. The D.C. Circuit is often called the second most important or second most powerful court. If the Supreme Court's powerful because it's final, what is it that makes the D.C. Circuit powerful? What does that saying mean, and what's special about the D.C. Circuit?
I think what makes the D.C. Circuit special and, in fact, unique is that, unlike any other court in the country, there are a profusion of federal statutes that actually designate the D.C. Circuit as the court with exclusive jurisdiction over some of the most significant agency appeals. So just to take environmental law, for example, D.C. Circuit has exclusive jurisdiction over Clean Air Act issues, CERCLA issues, RCRA issues, all sorts of other acronymic issues, all of them involving nationally significant environmental problems, all of which come up to the D.C. Circuit. So the role that it has had in that area actually dates back to 1870, when the first statute was passed giving the D.C. Circuit exclusive jurisdiction over then patent appeals. That was later taken away. But in the 60s and 70s, during the rise of the administrative state, many, many statutes, dozens, in fact over 100, specify the D.C. Circuit as either having exclusive or concurrent jurisdiction over significant administrative issues.
Aaron, what do you think? You're an administrative law scholar. This creates a situation where the D.C. Circuit hears an inordinate amount of the administrative law cases. What do you think about this specialization? Is it a good thing for the law? What effect does this kind of specialization have on the circuit and on the law more generally?
Well, first I want to chime in on the second most powerful or second most important court line. I did a blog post a couple of years ago about that, kind of poking fun at it, because what are some other contenders for the title? it seems to me that you can make a pretty good argument that the California Supreme Court is the second most powerful court in the United States. That law is not reviewable by the Supreme Court. California's economy is larger than France, and they drive the national economy in ways that I don't think most people even realize. So you say, well, wait a minute, why not California Supreme Court? Why isn't that the second most powerful? Or you say, you know what about the Delaware Court of Chancery? Almost every corporation in the United States is, incorporated in Delaware, and that law is set by the Chancery Court. So you can say, wait a minute, there's a good argument that maybe the Court of Chancery. But of course, that's not what we say. And I think some of it is, for a lot, like Cate was saying, it's because the D.C. Circuit has so many of the big admin law appeals. And in many ways, it's good because the court develops the sort of specialization that there's a lot of familiarity with admin law concepts coming out of that court. I remember watching arguments, and I remember when in particular Chief Judge Garland was just asking counsel, well, surely that violates the Chenery Doctrine. And there's a level of assumed knowledge that court has that everybody, if you're going to argue in that court, you need to have it, and all the judges have, that if you go out some other places, it's not as clear that it'll always be there. On the other hand, there are some downsides to having that much specialization, and that is the D.C. Circuit looks at admin law from a very they see certain types of cases and not other types of cases, but the law that they create then gets plug and played by other courts that don't have as much admin law familiarity. So, for instance, the D.C. Circuit does not hear immigration cases. One of the largest dockets of admin law cases in the country are your your immigration cases, and those are the ones being heard elsewhere. So the D.C. Circuit will, deal with EPA or something and say, well, this is how we do arbitrary and capricious review. Often courts will grab what the D.C. Circuit says about things, and it's possible they're not looking at the entire universe of cases when they announce some of these principles. So it's interesting to think how much the D.C. Circuit, it is the specialized court for admin law, but it doesn't actually see all of the admin law. And I wonder if that leads to some interesting dynamics.
Well, that's really interesting. Now, I want to push back on this circle back to this idea that it's the second most powerful court and ask you if there's another reason that it might be given that nickname. And it's not so much about the types of cases that it hears, but who's leaving the D.C. Circuit up to the Supreme Court. Cate, your former colleague at Hogan, John Roberts, famously was a judge on the D.C. Circuit. I think you testified in one of his hearings, if I recall correctly. And goes up to the Supreme Court. But he's not alone. Some of the most significant Supreme Court justices in history have come from the D.C. Circuit. So tell us a little bit about the role that the D.C. Circuit has played in kind of feeding justices to the Supreme Court. Yeah,
that's very true. There are 3 justices currently who all come from the D.C. Circuit, so a third of the court comes from that one federal circuit. I suspect that the reason has to do with the first thing that we were talking about, that when you have a court in which is reposed so much authority and responsibility for some of the most significant administrative law cases in the country, in fact, that administrative law cases are a third of the D.C. Circuit's docket. Federal government-facing cases are 67% of the D.C. Circuit's docket. So there's a significant experience that those judges get more quickly just because of the volume of those types of cases that I think makes them, in some estimations, more credible candidates off the bat for the Supreme Court. Other than Roberts, I will say, though, the most recent D.C. Circuit appointee before Roberts was Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1993. So they're not sending them up relatively recently, but certainly there's a history there.
So the 3 then right now are Roberts, Ginsburg,
and Thomas.
Okay, and then before that we had Justice Scalia, who's passed away, and Chief Justice Berger also is an alum of the D.C. Circuit. So it's a pretty good lineup. And
just an interesting tidbit is Justice Kagan was a nominee to the D.C. Circuit at the tail of the Clinton administration. It wasn't confirmed because they kind of waited it out in the slot. The slot go to Judge Kavanaugh. I'm trying to remember who got that slot. But I was curious to see, because Justice Gorsuch, who of course comes from the 10th Circuit, he clerked on the D.C. Circuit. He clerked for Judge Santel. And when he was going through his nomination process, I said, has he ever sat by designation on the D.C. Circuit? I was just kind of curious. So I did a search, and the answer is yes. There was a case where I believe they were sued all of the D.C. Circuit judges, so they were all recused. So they had to bring in an entirely non-D.C. Circuit panel to decide the law of the D.C. Circuit on this, and Judge Gorsuch was there. So in a way, we have 4.5 or 3.5 justices, because he did sit on the D.C. Circuit, if only for one sitting.
My favorite moment from the Gorsuch confirmation hearings is seeing Judge Santel, who is attending at least some of the hearings, and he has this kind of knowing nod up and down, like he's approving of what his student has said. And I think it actually got turned into a meme on the internet of Judge Santel's knowing nod during the confirmation hearings. But you mentioned Justice Kagan being nominated to the D.C. Circuit and unconfirmed. That's kind of a trend, isn't it? There are all sorts of pitched battles over D.C. Circuit nominees, and can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Real quick, as I think about it, I suspect, again, I'm just on the fly, I think it was probably John Roberts who got the Elena Kagan's seat, right? Because he was the first of the George Bush II nominees confirmed to that court. So presumably it was that seat. Again, I'd have to go back and look at the...
I think that may be right. He was confirmed in May of 2003.
Yeah, I have to look at the star charts to see how all the seats line up. But no, there's been a lot of fights about D.C. Circuit spots. So back when I was a law student, we had an event at Harvard Law School when my dean was Elena Kagan, and she told the story about how she had been nominated and she wasn't able to get confirmed. And the guest there was Judge David Santel, who was on the D.C. Circuit at the time, and he told almost an identical story from 15 years earlier, where he tried to get on, and eventually they were able to get him on, but it was a really hard battle to make that happen. And that hasn't changed since. If anything, it's only escalated. So there are some very high quality folks who were nominated who didn't make it through in the Bush administration. Then they had some really, some pitched battles in the Obama administration. They ended up changing the filibuster rule after Judge Srinivasan got on, and that's how you got the last 3 of the Obama nominees on the court, was after they changed the filibuster rules, because there's a lot of attention put on this particular court. And I think some of it's because they have a lot of these big administrative law issues, and because so many judges at the court have gone on to the Supreme Court, that it just makes it a very highly watched nomination process.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that that's not new. Aaron's point that this dates back many years is exactly right. I mean, John Roberts' first nomination was by the first George Bush, and that was put on ice. Alan Snyder, another Hogan Lovells appellate lawyer, was nominated during the Clinton administration. That was put on ice. Miguel Estrada, obviously. Caitlin Halligan. There are several.
Peter
Keisler. Yeah, I mean,
there's
several
like a club.
terrific
they should have lunch together.
Lawyers. Exactly. So it has been, at least since the 80s, so for the past 3 decades or so, a really significant issue.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the personalities of the judges who are on the D.C. Circuit right now. We've thrown around some of the names of some of the current judges, but I want to start by asking Aaron to tell us a little bit about Judge Posner and his mystery D.C. Circuit judge. Aaron had a recent blog post about this fun little riddle, and I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It was Abby Gluck, who's a professor at Yale, and Richard Posner, I'm used to calling him Judge Posner, and they did a survey of, I believe, 42 appellate court judges, and it was a anonymous survey to find out, what their views are on various things, and then they have the appendix of different folks. So they want to make sure that you don't know who they are, of the people they're interviewing, but they want to give you kind of the background and their questions that they ask them and their responses. So the one they call it the D.C. Circuit judge, and that's the only name. And I said, well, see if we can figure out who this person is. So we, good fun. So we looked at some of the answers to see if we could try to figure out who it was. And some of the clues that we got was this judge said it's really important that we focus on the standard of review. The standard of review came up in a couple of the answers. I'm like, okay, standard of review, that's a pretty good clue. At this point, you're like, why is that a clue? But bear with me, you'll see why that's a clue. And then they said, as I read the answer, the judge was supportive of the Supreme Court's decision in the Affordable Care Act case, the second Affordable Care Act case, King, and I said, okay, well, wait a minute. On the D.C. Circuit, who was in dissent there? So I'm remembering that. And then there's some more talk about some pretty high-level scholarship in there about different views of how judges should behave. So I said, I'm going to put all these clues together. And my guess, which no one has confirmed, but my guess is it's got to be Judge Harry Edwards. Judge Edwards authors a book all about standards of review. Judge Edwards was in dissent when the D.C. Circuit, it was how big when they had that case. And before he was on the bench, he was a professor at the University of Michigan Law School and has written several law review articles since joining the bench about what the academy can give to the courts to be more helpful as they decide cases. I said, so wait a minute. Standards of review, Affordable Care Act, and scholarship, my guess is Judge Edwards. That was kind of the game. So if anyone has other guesses, I'm welcome to hear them.
What do you think, Cate? Is that you think he's got it?
I think it's completely right, and I think that the giveaway is the federal standards of review, because Aaron's right. Judge Edwards has authored and just came out with a new edition. Full disclosure, I blurbed it. Very exciting. A new edition of federal standards of review. So I suspect that significant emphasis on standards of review, deference, Chevron deference is very Edwards-esque.
Well, let's talk about some other folks on the court right now. Now, your former judge, Judge Tatel, is on the D.C. Circuit. What can you tell us about him?
I can tell you that year clerking for Judge Tatel was the hardest and most fun year of my professional life. He is an extremely intellectually rigorous judge. He engages with his clerks, on a level that I think is incredibly intense. We had lunch together every day. There were at least 2 clerks assigned to any particular case, meaning that you had not just the judge to sort of work with and against when you were talking through an issue, but you had at least one other clerk to kind of triangulate the conversation a little bit and to bring in a new brain or a new voice at a particular stage of the case. As you likely know, Judge Tatel is also blind, and so one of the greatest takeaways from that clerkship was the art and science of writing and reading out loud, so that your writing was almost musical. We every day would be reading drafts with the judge, and of course reading them out loud, editing them on the fly, and the idea of actually asking, how does this sound? How does it sound out loud? Is something that I think about every day still, many years later.
Now I want to go find former Tatel clerks and kind of read their briefing and read it out loud and see, how that's kind of permeated down throughout his clerks. But
one fun related secret about Judge Tatel is, and I think some goes to this, he doesn't use footnotes. I've never seen, maybe he's done it in the past, I've never seen a Judge Tatel opinion with a footnote, which means that they're focusing on how all of this reads together without jumping on the page. It has to have enough coherence that the ideas flow together.
I can confirm Judge Tatel has been on the bench since 1993. He has used 0 footnotes in opinions that he has written.
LRW professors, legal research and writing professors across the country are cheering right now.
Brian Garner's probably not cheering, but
right,
the rest of us are cheering.
This is a pitched battle over whether footnotes are good things or not. I always find that the fun is in the footnotes, so I'm not going to be in a position to decide whether to include one, but I like reading them because there's always something buried there that people don't want you to see. Well, let's talk a little bit about you, Aaron, and your experience clerking on the D.C. Circuit.
Sure. So I clerked for Judge Brown. Judge Brown recently retired from the court, not took senior status. She retired and went back to California, and I wonder if she will ever come back to Washington, D.C. Maybe she'll, if Georgetown invites her, maybe she will come, but probably don't invite her for a few years. And it was a lot of fun. Judge Brown had been a justice on the California Supreme Court, and she came here, and she was very, very smart, but self-taught in many ways. She liked to read, and she read more than probably anybody I've ever seen. And her recall was really amazing. So we would go into a meeting with the judge, and she would say, well, I think Kipling put it best, and say this like full stanza, like a quote. And we're like, that was awesome. That's exactly on point. And then we would never hear it again. The next time it would be, there is this sociologist at Princeton, or there's this French poet. I don't know how she did it, but she could remember all of these things. And then you would see that in her writing. She was actually very bookish and not at all an extrovert, very kind of quiet. But then she would write, and you would read it, and you're like, this is the most powerful personality. And no, she's really, really shy, but she writes with a lot of power. And so it was a lot of fun working with it. There's things that you could say, no clerk could write this. And it's because, no, this is Judge Brown. It takes somebody who's been reading French poetry and Princeton sociologists and Kipling and the Bible. Our year, she was big on studying the Book of Job. So she knew all sorts of Book of Job stuff. And you put all that in a mixer, and then you get Judge Brown. And the clerks would just kind of go along for the ride.
I had lunch recently with former Judge Brown, and it was one of the most intellectually stimulating experiences of my life. She has a capacity for making clever connections between seemingly disparate ideas that I just frankly have never seen before. And it was really one of the most intellectually enjoyable experiences of my entire legal career.
I can tell you, just having argued in front of her several times, she was such a pleasure to argue in front of. You know, people talk about the old canard that a good argument should be like a conversation. She was so warm and engaged as a judge that it really was. She drew you into that conversation. And I also will tell you, I have an abiding affinity for Judge Brown because she wrote a rip-roaring dissent in an en banc case defending my honor, in which she repeatedly said, as arguing counsel said during her argument. And, I felt like, the fact that she was quoting me during her dissent, I think I know which case
this is.
Yeah, I think you probably do.
It's a great case, American Meat Institute.
There actually is a meat institute.
There is. Yeah. There's more than one meat trade association, although there's been some mergers over the years. But she has a fantastic line, actually. I think Aaron was talking recently about how much he likes this line that you just referenced. And Aaron, would you mind
Sure.
reading that?
It's funny that this came up. Not at all. This was not planned. But I had done a blog post when Judge Brown retired where I collected all of her dissents, and I tried to take some lines from them. And in the American Meat Institute case, this is how I don't think she opens her dissent, but it's towards the start of it. This case is not really about country of origin labeling. It's not even about patriotism or protectionism. And it is certainly not about health and safety. What is apparent from the record and the briefing, there we go, that's you, is that this case is about seeking competitive advantage. One need only look at the parties and amici to recognize this rule benefits one group of American farmers and producers while interfering with the practice and profits of other American businesses who rely on imported meat to serve their customers. That is a very Judge Brown sentence. No clerk writes that sentence. That's a confidence of someone who's been a judge for a very long time and has very firm and solid views of her own. No clerk can say a judge, I think you should say this. It just doesn't work that way. That's the judge writing as the judge.
She's also totally right, too.
That's right. In my prior life, I was a client. My organization was a client of Cate Stetson, so we were proudly represented by her in any number of cases. And I can tell you that the American Meat Institute had a fantastic lawyer. It was very the first opinion by the D.C. Circuit was the right one. That quote by Judge Brown is only my second favorite quote by Judge Brown, though. She has a concurrence that's really a dissent in a case brought by dairy farmers. It's called the Headinga case, where she talks about the long trajectory of federal regulations, particularly in the dairy industry, and says that we've been negotiating the terms of surrender of the death of cowboy capitalism for the last 80 years. It's a rip-roaring opinion, and it's a lot of fun to read. Well, with that, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back here in a few minutes to have a lightning round where a mystery D.C. Circuit judge of our own has provided us with some trivia questions to see if we can stump our D.C. Circuit experts, Cate and Aaron. So we'll be back in a second. Hey, Mark, what do you call milk where you just skim the cream off the top?
Skim milk?
You'd think so, but not if you're the Food and Drug Administration, which forces dairy farmers to call natural skim milk, quote, imitation skim milk. And the Institute for Justice is taking the FDA to court for forcing dairy farmers to say things that just aren't true. Randy and Karen Sowers are dairy farmers in northern Maryland who believe in what they call responsible farming. Their cows are pasture-raised, their chickens are cage-free, and their dairy products are as pure and additive-free as the law allows. Randy has repeatedly asked state and federal agencies over the years to allow his dairy to sell pure skim milk without any additives and call it what it is, skim milk. But the government always says no. The FDA has decreed that skim milk can only be labeled as skim milk if artificial vitamin A and D additives are injected into it. Failing to do that can result in fines of $1,000 per offense and the complete closure of the creamery. To learn more about IJ's new free speech lawsuit against the FDA, visit ij.org. Okay, so speaking of D.C. Circuit mystery judges, as I mentioned, we have our own D.C. Circuit mystery judge who shared some trivia questions with us to see if we can stump our two D.C. Circuit experts. Now, we're going to do this lightning round style. So the first one to answer correctly is awarded an arbitrary and pointless point. And I expect that no one will have the answers to very many of these questions. These are personality questions about the different judges, but I think they're a fun way to learn about the judges. So let's get started. All right. So which two judges on the D.C. Circuit share the birth date of Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin? So two D.C. Circuit judges have the same birth date as Lincoln and Darwin. Who are the two judges?
I can't believe I don't know this.
But after today, you will.
I'm going to guess Kavanaugh and Rogers.
Ooh, that's close. Kavanaugh and Centel. I'm going to give her the arbitrary point for that one. Aaron doesn't even get a try. All right. Now, this one's actually controversial. Okay. Which judge is known for baking the best cookies in the courthouse?
I suspect it's going to be Judge Henderson. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a fight on that, but I will say this. Judge Henderson likes to decorate her door to her chambers, and she likes to keep a festive environment. So I imagine she makes a mean cookie.
All right. Do we have any other guesses?
You know, I would have guessed the same thing, but based solely on the door decorations, which probably doesn't correlate.
That's fantastic. So the answer is Judge Millett. Judge Millett has got the best cookies in the courthouse, per our mystery judge, and I'm not disclosing who our mystery judge is.
So what's the controversy?
Is it Millett or Henderson?
Who else is in the running?
Yeah, I don't. You know what? I'm not going to speculate because I don't want to get in more trouble than I'm already getting in. Okay, which judge brings his or her dog to chambers with great frequency? Any idea on this one?
In the D.C. Circuit?
In the D.C. Circuit.
I was going to say, I think Judge Lamberth used to bring his dog in, but I would guess Judge Pillard.
That's right. We have another point
for
Cate. Cate's
how did you possibly know that?
This is totally going on my resume. This is fantastic.
That's right. I'm going to give you 7 points for that one. Which judge is an avid genealogist?
An avid genealogist.
Yeah. Which judge is looking up the family tree and figuring out, his or her ancestors?
All right, I'll take a guess, and this is just a guess. I would say Judge Griffith. Judge Griffith is LDS. It is a big part of the Mormon culture to do genealogy, so I'm taking a guess that it's Judge Griffith.
Not only are you wrong, I'm taking away 2 points. It's Judge Wilkins. All right, you're behind, Aaron. You need to catch up. All right.
I'm not going to tell Sheldon that I would have had the same guess because then I'd take away the 2 points.
That's right. So which judge played high school basketball on the same team as Danny Manning?
That's easy. This is easy. Give me the points, please. I beg you.
Go for it.
This is going to be Judge Srinivasan.
Judge Srinivasan. That's right.
Okay.
All right. We'll give you the points, but because it was kind of a layup of a question, you only get 2 points.
So now I'm 0.
Yes.
I'm back to where I started. All right.
All right, here we go. Which judge was a neighbor of and worked as a congressional intern for liberal Democratic congressman and presidential candidate Morris Mo Udall. Who's the neighbor of Mo Udall? Everyone should know this.
Aaron?
I'm trying to reason backwards. Where was Mo Udall? Where was he senator from? Can you give us that? Can you give us?
I actually don't know. The Udalls are normally in like
Utah or Colorado.
Colorado, Utah, kind of the Mountain West.
That's what I'm trying to think. Because I can't think of any of the judges who grew up in the West.
Current judge or senior judge?
This is a current judge.
And they grew up in the West. Whew.
I'm ready for the answer. I'm going to give it to you. This one is Judge Griffith. So if you'd only saved your Griffith answer to this one, you would have gotten it. Okay.
But Judge Griffith is from Virginia.
I'm telling you that this is maybe my source is wrong on this, but
okay.
this is I'll go back and check the source. All right. So which judge was present at the speech during the 1960 presidential campaign at which JFK announced his intention to create the Peace Corps? Which judge?
I'm going to guess Judge Tatel.
That's right. And I give you 18 points because it was your judge. And this is not loaded against Aaron at all. But you had to get that one, and that's great. I thought that was kind of a fun one. Apparently, he was a student at the University of Michigan at the time and was attending a campaign event when JFK made the announcement. Okay, which judge has a large photo of Robert Bork in the foyer to his chambers? This one should be easier.
I'm going to guess that it's Judge Santel.
Oh, Aaron, that's minus 10 points. It was Judge Randolph. Like you're back down. Okay.
Well, why do I lose 10 points for that?
That's the thing about arbitrary, pointless points. All right, which judge can be seen frequently in the owner's booth at Redskin games? Owner's booth at Redskin games. Now the real question is why anybody's attending a Redskins game. That's the bigger question. We're gonna go with.
I'm gonna guess. I'm sure it's wrong, and I'll lose 45 points. Judge Kavanaugh.
Oh, that's wrong, and you do in fact lose 45 points. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's Judge Edwards. Judge Edwards, our mystery judge, or likely mystery judge for the Judge Posner article.
Okay, so I reasoned. Here's my defense. This is why I thought maybe Judge Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh of the judges, he is the one who is from the D.C. area. So he wouldn't want
That's a good guess.
Who would have grown up a Redskins fan. Why is Judge Edwards going to the Redskins instead of the Lions?
That's a good guess, and I think next time we should invite him to the podcast, and we'll ask him that question. All right, we got two more questions. Okay, these are oral argument questions because we're going to talk about oral arguments here in a little bit. All right, this one's a fun one. It's one of my favorite lines from oral argument history. But so in response to a comment from government counsel that his question might call into doubt the legal underpinnings of the modern administrative state, which D.C. Circuit judge replied, "We can do only so much in one day"?
That is definitely Judge Doug Ginsburg. I was at that argument.
Oh, okay, very good. All right, well, I was going to give you 55 points to make up the difference, but because you're at the argument, it's only worth 5 points. I'm sorry, Aaron.
Wait a minute. She got a bunch of points because she clerked for the judge.
Right, but you were there. You were just there attending the argument.
I'm really enjoying this game.
Yes. All right. This is how these competitions work. Okay, here we go. Last question, Aaron. This is your chance to come from behind and win this competition, and all the glory that comes with it. All right. After argument in a case involving street protests directed at the Bush 43 administration, one member of the panel asked the others if they had ever participated in a protest demonstration before becoming a judge. Which judge answered, "No, but I've been the target of many"? Which judge has been the target of many protests?
I'm sure I'll be wrong, but I'm going to go with Judge Santel.
Judge Santel, does he strike you as like protestable?
Well, because he had been in charge of the independent counsel in the 90s.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. That's close. This person was a former DAG during the Nixon administration and has a connection to Georgetown Law Center. All right, let's give it to the law students to see if they can figure out who the judge is. Silverman. Okay, we award. What's your name? Michael gets 100 points and he wins our contest. All right. I'm sorry that our experts, the student comes from behind to win the competition. All right. Well, thank you for playing with us. We enjoyed that. So let's talk speaking of oral arguments, let's keep going and talk about what it's like to litigate before the D.C. Circuit. So both of you have quite a bit of experience litigating at the D.C. Circuit. Cate, in particular, has argued some of the most important D.C. Circuit cases in recent memory, has been involved in some of the most important cases at the D.C. Circuit. Aaron, I've actually been a client of Aaron's as well in his job at Kirkland & Ellis in, for example, challenges to EPA regulations. So tell me, how is briefing different at the D.C. Circuit? Like, what makes the D.C. Circuit different in terms of a litigation experience, if it is?
I'm not sure that it's too much different than briefing in the other federal circuits. I will say that just because of the nature of the D.C. Circuit's areas of expertise, you tend to encounter a significant number of acronyms that you may not in other courts of appeals. But not too long ago, the D.C. Circuit instituted two rules. One of them was that you had to have a glossary in the front of your brief. And the second one was that if you used what the clerk's office arbitrarily deemed an inordinate amount of acronyms in your brief, you would get a spanking in the form of a letter from the D.C. Circuit clerk's office basically saying, please refile your brief and don't use as many acronyms.
That's fantastic.
So I think the lawyers are on notice at this point that even if they are, arguing a case involving SMICRA, RCRA, and FIFRA, they still have to explain exactly what they're talking about.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't been aware of that one.
So there's also two local rules in the D.C. Circuit that I think are interesting. One is in the D.C. Circuit, if standing is at all in doubt, the opening brief has to raise standing, which really ought to be the rule everywhere. The D.C. Circuit sees the wisdom of it because they get more cases where standing actually is the issue. But I think that's interesting. But the one that I like is you have put an asterisk against the main authorities that you rely on. And you would know, you've litigated elsewhere. I've not seen that elsewhere. Is that just anywhere else where you put the asterisk next to the main authorities that you rely on?
Not that I can think of. I think that is a uniquely D.C. Circuit thing. And in fact, I once, some years ago, forgot to add the acronyms next to the cases on which I chiefly relied. And I got a call from somebody I knew in the clerk's office, and she said, so Cate, are you just not chiefly relying on any cases, or did you forget the asterisks? And I said, thank you, I forgot the asterisks. But that is a unique rule as well.
Yeah, so I remember sometimes you'll see the asterisk will be next to like Chevron or something, and we're like, all right, that's not especially helpful because every case is a Chevron case almost in the D.C. Circuit. But it is actually kind of interesting. So sometimes I will play the game with the D.C. Circuit reviewed, where we will say, can you guess what the case is about? I would just grab the asterisk of the chiefly relied upon authorities and see if you can tell what the case is about just by the cases that they cite, which I think is kind of it's a very nerdy thing to do. But I don't know. I enjoy it.
Well, and I can say that there are.
I'm better at that than at trivia. I'll say that.
There are fights over which cases should get the asterisk among parties and party counsel. Sometimes there are instances where I remember one case I was involved in where there were somewhere close to 160 parties, individual litigants, all kind of crammed together. They each filed their own lawsuit, all crammed together on basically a single brief. And you can imagine with 160 different sets of lawyers, well, A, you can imagine what the hourly rates are for, anytime anybody met. But B, there were some pitched battles over that asterisk, like which case is going to get the asterisk, who thinks this is the case we're chiefly relying on. And it was something of a silly exercise at times, but it is kind of an interesting quirk of the D.C. Circuit. What about arguing before the D.C. Circuit, Cate? I mentioned that you have close to 90 oral arguments. It seems to me that a lot of those are in the D.C. Circuit. I feel like every time I turn around, you've got another great argument at the D.C. Circuit. So tell me what it's like arguing at the D.C. Circuit.
I think what first comes to mind is that, and this sadly isn't always the case with other circuits across the country, but the D.C. Circuit judges on panels are unfailingly thoroughly prepared And they can be very, very rigorous, and some of them can be very demanding. Their temperaments are not all the same. But if you match their preparation and their engagement, showing that you also have prepared and are willing to engage, I enjoy arguing in the D.C. Circuit. Don't tell any of the other circuits more than any other court, because of that kind of dynamic.
Oh, that's great. Do you have any particularly memorable arguments at the D.C. Circuit that kind of stand out?
Well, we've talked about one a little bit, which was that Mead Institute case, but the reason it stood out for me actually is a more personal one. I have two girls who are now junior in high school and an eighth grader. And when I argued the en banc Mead Institute case, I brought my girls. And it was, at that point, the first argument that they had seen me deliver. They've now seen me deliver a Supreme Court argument, but at the time, that was the first one. And I will never forget going out to lunch with my husband and daughters afterward and hearing my girls discussing whether Judge Wilkins or Judge Garland, was or was not going to, come down on my side. They were wrong, of course. Neither of them did, but just watching my girls sort of engage on that level was an absolute thrill. The other story I can tell you is somewhat more recent. It involves Judge Santel. One of the mantras to arguing in front of a court of appeals is that you must not treat it like a jury argument. And it is a significant mistake if you bring what some people perceive to be the level of fervor or rhetoric that you might use in front of a jury. And I had a case a month or two ago where I argued first. My opposing counsel got up. It was a Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act case, and he began his argument by saying, if ever there were an exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, it is this case. And Judge Santel, in his typical laconic North Carolinian way, sits back in his chair and just says, "Oh, come on." And the lawyer was so startled by that. And then the judge went off on a spiel about how you shouldn't be arguing like you're arguing to a jury. But it was that kind of classic Santel moment that really stuck with me.
I want to get that audio and make it into my ringtone. That's fantastic.
Yeah, you have to watch out. There are some of the judges that if you don't know what you're talking about, they'll be kind of polite and they just don't ask a lot of questions. There are other judges that then just double down and they'll keep going to make sure that this will never happen again in their court. I remember there was an argument once where counsel, I think it's for an agency. I'm sure I'm misremembering, but I think the panel was Judge Brown, Judge Edwards, and Judge Silberman. And Judge Edwards and Judge Silberman can be pretty tough on the bench. And Judge Silberman wanted to know why they proceeded via rulemaking and not adjudication. And the counsel said, that's just how we decided to do it. And that wasn't good enough for Judge Silberman. He's like, well, do you know the difference between rulemaking and adjudication? And the lawyer said, well, of course I know the difference between rulemaking and adjudication. And then Judge Silberman said, well, tell the court, what is the difference between rulemaking and adjudication? And at this point, it's pretty apparent that the counsel was not at all prepared for this question and kind of, hemmed and hawed and fumbled. They issued the opinion, and then Judge Silberman attached a one-line separate concurrence to the opinion saying, I still don't understand, to the effect of, I still don't understand why they proceeded this way and not that way. And I'm like, wow. So that was one thing I learned. If you want to argue in court, you have to be ready because this isn't like, everybody's happy here. No, this is a professional place, and if you're not bringing your A game, you are disrespecting the court, and there are judges who will make sure that you know that.
I have to guess that there's some Georgetown law students in the audience who have taken Judge Silberman's class, who know what it feels like to get those pointed questions from Judge Silberman. So that's fantastic. Well, speaking of students and bringing your A game, both of you have something of a dream job for a lot of the students here, and tell us what you would recommend to students who are interested in doing appellate litigation. What would be your advice?
Well, this is always a tough question because I always tell law students that it is a mistake to think about appellate litigation as a career because, of course, you're thinking about appellate litigation as a career. You're in law school, you're reading appellate decisions, you're doing moot courts, so the gravitational pull is going to be towards appellate litigation. I'm obviously a screaming hypocrite for saying that, though, because I've been an appellate litigator for 20 years. I think what I would say to law students is, in addition to what you would generally think, which is try to clerk at any level. It doesn't matter. If you clerk for a trial judge who is a great writer and who will give you that mentorship that is the classic hallmark of a clerkship, that kind of old-fashioned apprenticeship, clerk for a trial judge. It doesn't matter. As long as you find somebody who is a good writer and a good mentor. Read as many good briefs as you can. Read as many good opinions as you can. Listen to good oral arguments. But on top of that, the other thing that I tend to tell people is don't just read law stuff. Read other things that interest you. Read long-form sports reporting, which I find is some of the most kind of dynamic writing out there. Read poetry, read short stories, things that actually make you think about the rhythm and the cadence of an argument. And the last thing I would say, especially with respect to argument, I think a lot of prospective law students think that they might be good litigators or good appellate lawyers because they love to argue. That is a terrible going-in position. You are never going to be a good litigator or appellate litigator because you love to argue. You're going to be good at what you do because you know how to persuade. And arguing and persuading are two very different things.
No, that's right. So I became an appellate litigator kind of by accident. I went to law school because I wanted to be an antitrust lawyer. My background was economics. I've been an economics major. I spent my third year of law school in England studying European competition law. I interviewed at law firms saying, I want to be in your antitrust group. I'd never said, do you want to be an appellate? That wasn't even on my list. I didn't put appellate on my list at all. And I got hired to be in the antitrust group. But I clerked. So I clerked a couple of times, and then I started at the firm. And the firm said, well, do antitrust. That's great. That could be your group. But we have some cases in the D.C. Circuit doing admin law stuff. So can you just kind of work on these cases too, but your home is still antitrust? And I said, oh, sure, I'm happy to do that. And I did that, and then they said, okay, well, you've done this case. We'll do another one, do another one, do another one. And then soon enough, I'm doing like class actions and some place that's nothing to do with anything I'd done with my clerking. And at that point, I still like to believe I was an antitrust lawyer, but I think the antitrust group at that point said, well, he's one of the appellate folks. So how did that happen? It happened because I clerked. That's part of the game. But the other thing is if you really kind of like the law part of law school, you're going to naturally kind of gravitate towards briefing. And there's not that much difference between being the summary judgment or the motion to dismiss briefer and being the appellate briefer. And if you find yourself as the law writer, soon enough you're going to be in the doing appellate work. It's just the nature of gravitational pull, because there's people who like to do that work, and there are other people who like to have someone else do that work for them. And if you're happy to do that work, the work will come. I would recommend that if you're interested in that, don't go into the firm saying that's all I want to do. Be willing to do other things, and then look for opportunities to work on pro bono appeals and things of that sort, so you can get some of that experience down, and then it's more likely that you'll be able to make that work.
Now, Cate, you mentioned your first oral argument was a pro bono case. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. This was back in 2000. I was still an associate. We had a pro bono appeal in the Ninth Circuit on behalf of the National Parks and Conservation Association, which oddly was suing the National Park Service for a problem with a NEPA issue, Environmental Protection Act issue, that had come up with a recent Park Service reg. One of the interesting things about that argument was that the Ninth Circuit occasionally will schedule arguments in Anchorage and in Hawaii. And strangely, it always schedules arguments in Anchorage in July and always schedules the Hawaii arguments in December or January. It's
funny
fascinating.
How that works.
So this argument actually was held in Anchorage, Alaska. I was also pregnant with our first daughter at the time, so I flew to Anchorage about 7 months pregnant and argued a case on behalf of the whales of Glacier Bay, feeling somewhat like a whale myself. But it was an amazing experience and a wonderful first oral argument to have.
So you have to do an asterisk on which argument was your daughter's first argument to attend then.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Right.
That's fantastic. Let's go to our third and final segment. We want to talk a little bit, to wrap things up, about some examples of the big cases coming out of the D.C. Circuit. We've talked about some of the statutes that direct that cases be addressed in the D.C. Circuit. We've talked about how the D.C. Circuit decides legal issues on some of the biggest policy questions of our day. And many of those cases end up at the Supreme Court. So let's talk about those a little bit. And Aaron, let's start with you because I think you've got your blog has an online symposium right now about one of these cases that's pending before the Supreme Court.
Correct. So the Yale Journal on Regulation has a blog, the Notice and Comment, where a lot of practitioners and administrative law professors write. And the case that there's an online symposium right now is Lucia v. SEC. Though, yeah, that's right. That's still Lucia v. SEC. I wonder if they flipped it, but Lucia was petitioner. And the case is about the appointment of the SEC's administrative law judges and whether or not they are principal, inferior, or employees. The D.C. Circuit says... the reason I say principal is I have a blog post this week where I say, wait a minute, if the question is final authority, isn't there an argument that if you have final authority that you have no supervisor? Well, if that's the case, then isn't this principal and not inferior? Anyway, to step back, the way the Appointments Clause works is it says that certain folks have to be appointed by the president nominates and the Senate confirms. There are other folks that can be that way, inferior officers, where the Senate or Congress can say we leave it up to the ordinary appointments process, or we can vest appointments power in the courts of law, heads of departments, or in the president. Or there's also employees, which are not officers at all. And the question is, these SEC ALJs, are they officers or are they employees? In the D.C. Circuit, says they're employees, which means that they can be appointed not by heads of a department. The 10th Circuit, my home stomping grounds, in an opinion by Judge Matheson of Utah, says, no, that's not right. These are obviously at least inferior officers. That created a circuit split, which is now at the Supreme Court. And obviously we don't know how the case is going to be resolved, but it can be very significant because if the Supreme Court were to say that these are inferior officers, one, that means that a lot of decisions by a lot of ALJs potentially could be subject to litigation. But more than that, there's another issue hanging out there, which is especially at the independent agencies, because the ALJs have some independence protection. So you have the heads of agencies are independent and the ALJs are independent. Well, we have two layers of protection. And that runs into the free enterprise case. Now, they might be able to write around that. Who knows what the Supreme Court's going to do? But some people are saying, well, wait a minute, how is that going to work at the independent agencies? So there's a lot of agency adjudications. People who care in that or watch in that space are paying close attention to how the Supreme Court resolves this one.
So it seems this is a case about kind of constitutional accountability, right? Like, to what extent are these administrative law judges accountable to the executive officers, to the duly elected executive officials, right? So you've got kind of the president who nominates independent commissioners, and then it's hard for the president to kind of remove those independent commissioners. And then are they the ones choosing the administrative law judges, or is it just some other employee in the organization is choosing these administrative law judges? So you're getting decision making by people in the SEC that's kind of more and more removed from a democratically accountable individual who we can vote out of office if we've got a problem with them. Is that kind of one of the concerns that's animating this?
That's one of the themes to the argument. There's some tension there. I actually just read the post earlier this morning by my friend and occasional co-author Chris Walker, where he says, well, wait a minute, there's another constitutional tension, which is these are adjudicators, and usually we want adjudicators to not be subject to the political bias that comes from being connected too closely to the administration. Now, some people say, well, that means maybe we need to rethink how we're doing agency adjudication altogether. Maybe
move it into the courts.
Maybe that's a bigger question. Well, you've seen some of those proposed solutions, things of that sort. It's funny, actually, in the en banc oral argument of Lucia was in the D.C. Circuit, and it went before the entire en banc court, and the court split exactly. The same number were for, the same number were against the agency, which doesn't happen very often. That's a pretty good way to get Supreme Court review if you have a circuit split and the en banc D.C. Circuit is exactly divided on the question. But at the oral argument, one of the proposed solutions to the problem is you can vest appointments in courts of law. It's in the appointments clause. So my friend Ken Barnett is a professor at Georgia. One of his ideas is, well, how about we vest the appointments of all the ALJs in the D.C. Circuit? So the D.C. Circuit will appoint all the ALJs, and wouldn't the world be a better place if that was that's the argument. And it's funny, they mentioned that during the oral argument to the en banc D.C. Circuit, and I believe it was Judge Kavanaugh said, yeah, that's not going to happen. And you get laughter in the audience. The D.C. Circuit would hate that. Times 1,000, they would hate that. That isn't going to happen, but it shows some of the ways people are trying to think what to do with this issue.
And we're going to play that clip for you.
You may lose that argument. If you lose that argument, then the question will be which for-cause removal goes. Presumably that would be the MSP's, PB's protection, not the ALJ's, although, again, who knows?
Your Honor, I just recently read a law review article that suggested that the answer would be one that I'm sure this court would be happy with, which is that this court appoint all of the administrative law judges.
I read that too. I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah.
So this is why I'm reluctant to speculate on the remedies if we were unfortunately to lose a series of cases, and we hope that we win this case now.
Okay, so that's kind of a wonky constitutional law / administrative law issue that is really important. But there's another issue that before the change in administration I kind of thought was going to end up at the D.C. Circuit, and it's an issue that is on the lips of a lot more people than just kind of D.C. Circuit gurus, and that was the net neutrality case, right? One of the biggest policy questions of our day that, people from, high school kids on up all have very strong opinions on net neutrality. And it was a legal question about whether or not the FCC had the legal authority to issue its net neutrality order, and that was one of the big cases of the D.C. Circuit that's kind of unique in some ways. Can you tell us about that one, Cate?
Sure. And I just realized I was about to open my mouth and say a famous Judge Tatel line that he says with literally every case that we talk about in chambers, which is, this is a fascinating case. This is a fascinating case. So the net neutrality issue, and net neutrality, when we talk about it, means essentially what other people phrase sort of open internet. So the question about whether the FCC can regulate the internet, regulate broadband service as a telecommunications offering, essentially. The reason that this came up to the D.C. Circuit is because back in 2015, and there was sort of prior skirmishes in the D.C. Circuit in 2010 and 2014, I think. But in 2015, the FCC issued a decision deciding that that broadband services were no longer information services, they were telecommunication services. And by that reclassification, the FCC was able to essentially pull broadband internet into its regulatory ambit. So the FCC was able to issue net neutrality regulations, anti-throttling, anti-blocking, some of the other lingo that you hear tossed around. That came up to the D.C. Circuit, and in a split decision, the D.C. Circuit, applying Chevron deference, concluded that the FCC permissibly could interpret the offering of telecommunications services to include broadband internet. The reason that this is so fascinating has to do with what I think, and maybe Aaron can chime in on this as well, is a little bit of a groundswell about the limits of Chevron deference and what Chevron deference tends to wreak, particularly at the change of administration. Because in late last year, as you all likely know, the FCC, now headed by a new chairman, Ajit Pai, came out with a ruling invoking Chevron deference and deciding that, in fact, broadband internet services were not telecommunication services. They were information offerings. And because they were information offerings, they were no longer subject to the FCC's regulatory authority. The reason I think that's so significant is because if you look at the invocation of Chevron in the FCC's recent order, and you look at the invocation of Chevron in the 2016 D.C. Circuit decision, you realize, and in fact Chevron itself was a case that arose from a change of agency position between the Carter and the Reagan administrations involving an EPA reg. And you realize that this question that is starting to percolate up, including in a now famous Judge Gorsuch opinion, about whether it is, as Garrett said to you all at the beginning of this, emphatically the judiciary to say what the law is, where the limits of Chevron deference are when it becomes evident that an agency can invoke that deference to essentially put in place its own policy preferences, and whether or not that is a good thing or a salutary thing or a bad thing.
So it's interesting on the net neutrality is this has been in the D.C. Circuit in various iterations for a very long time. It's bounced back and forth, and Judge Tatel writes all of these things. Is he done 3 of them? I think he's done at least 3.
I know he's done at least 2, maybe all 3.
Didn't he do the first one? Maybe it's only the 2. But when they challenged the latest one, there was a lottery to see where the challenge, the new net neutrality is going to be. And as I understand the story, the Ninth Circuit won the lottery. So it looked like there's a chance that this wasn't going to be in the D.C. Circuit anymore, though it's been in the D.C. Circuit for almost 20 years. The case, as I understand it, has been transferred back to the D.C. Circuit, so it will stay in the D.C. Circuit. But on the broader point about Chevron, I mentioned earlier the article by Posner and Gluck where they survey appellate judges. And it's interesting. One of their findings, again, it's a small sample size. It's 42, but who knows how much you can draw from that. But one of the things that they suggest is that there is a different view of Chevron by judges in the D.C. Circuit and those judges outside of the D.C. Circuit, that judges in the D.C. Circuit are much more comfortable with Chevron than judges outside of the D.C. Circuit, which, if true, I mean, all judges are bound until the Supreme Court acts, but it suggests that the D.C. Circuit, maybe because of the docket they get, the number of cases they see, or how they've been trained or whatnot, but it suggests that that's one way the D.C. Circuit is different.
This is a topic that's of keen interest to the folks at my organization, the Institute for Justice. We care very much about these deference issues, and we're very much in line with now Justice Gorsuch's view that judges should reassume the role of interpreting laws rather than allowing federal regulators to basically get a thumb on the scale in favor of their interpretation. But the net neutrality piece is interesting because I've been to Federalist Society conference after Federalist Society conference for a decade in a legal career, and there's always this question whether now that conservatives are in the administration, will everybody switch sides? During the Obama administration, conference after conference said Chevron deference is bad. It's bad for reasons A, B, and C. But now that Chevron deference will help a conservative administration, will they switch sides? Well, at the last Federalist Society conference in November, the entire conference was on administrative law, and I've never heard more anti-Chevron deference panels in my entire life attending Federalist Society events. With the keystone speech by newly minted Justice Gorsuch, where in front of an audience of thousands of Federalist Society folks, goes after Chevron deference with guns blazing. So it's an interesting moment because you do often see kind of side switch. You see the current FCC invoking Chevron deference to kind of protect their change in policy. But it's not clear to me that kind of the conservative intellectual movement is switching positions, even though it's temporarily beneficial to be more favorable to Chevron right now.
And I would, if you have not yet read it, I would commend that Gorsuch decision to you, if only because it does really make you think about some of the foundational aspects of deference that we've been taught since Chevron issued in the early 1980s. And I think it's not possible to really overplay the importance of that opinion, even in his nomination. I think when Don McGahn talked at the CPAC conference several weeks ago, one of the things that he said was that opinion is what brought now Justice Gorsuch to the president's attention.
Well, and it's almost like you kind of opened the floodgates with his opinion while he was still in the 10th Circuit, but then you had Judge Kethledge has come out with a strong indictment of Chevron deference. Judge Brown, while she was still in the D.C. Circuit, came out against Chevron deference. Judge on the Third Circuit, Judge Kent Jordan on the D.C. Circuit, the Third Circuit came out with a pretty strong indictment. Judge Kavanaugh, not in an opinion, but in a number of speeches, has laid out some pretty strong and different types of arguments against Chevron deference, and those don't seem to me to be losing steam despite the change in the administration. But again, we'll see. We're only a year and a half in. So we'll see as these doctrines are tested. I think we've got time for just discussion of two more cases very quickly. Aaron, can you tell us about the PHH case?
Sure, the PHH case. So last May was a big deal in the D.C. Circuit because they had two en banc cases at the same day. The D.C. Circuit doesn't go en banc very often. En banc means the entire court hears it, all the active judges. That doesn't happen very often. I actually went back and checked, and the number is very, very small. But they had two of them on the same day, and they were both important constitutional questions. So we already talked about Lucia. PHH was the other one. PHH is about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and how it is set up with the director, and whether there's too much insulation between the director and the president. The way that Congress, when they set up the agency, was they have a single director, so it's not like the FTC where you have multi-member body. It's just one. And with the FTC, it's a multi-member body, and you have to have different political parties represented on the board. Not so with the CFPB, and the CFPB has other features which give it a lot of a buffer between the head of the agency and the administration, and the question is whether or not that is constitutional. The panel opinion was written by Judge Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh said this is not constitutional because it's so much power in a single person that makes this you can have Humphrey's executor, you can have those cases, but this goes beyond those, and thus we need to draw the line somewhere. It went to the D.C. Circuit, and the D.C. Circuit en banc went the other direction on that. A bunch of different opinions, hundreds of pages. I think it's like 250 pages of opinions if you add them all up. If you ever want to spend a day, there's a day right there for you. But that case. It's interesting because, of course, the litigation began during the Obama administration. Then the Trump administration has come to power. So there was questions: was the president going to fire the head of the CFPB? Then the head of CFPB, resigns to go run for governor of Ohio, and then you had the little fight about who's in charge of the agency. It's a lot of things still happening here, and I'm curious to see how it all plays out. If the Supreme Court ever gets involved, how litigation is going to unfold. But this is a very important case about the meaning of the president's powers under Article 2.
All right, Cate, can you take us out with our last case? This is another case involving a statute that many of you are not familiar with, but in reality, you probably experience it in your day-to-day life. It's the Telecommunications Privacy Act. And if you've gotten an unwanted phone call or unwanted text message, this is the statute that applies ostensibly.
Well, with that fascinating introduction, so this case is almost interesting for two reasons. First, because of its odd longevity. In this case, managed to make a liar out of me and my colleagues twice, actually. This was argued in mid-October 2016. It was decided in mid-March 2018. And after the case was argued in October of 2016, I had some questions from my colleagues in the communications practice about when the decision was likely to issue. And I said, well, the D.C. Circuit really tries to issue all of its opinions by the time that the clerks change over. So figure July or August at the very outside, July or August 2017. So that comes and goes. And the communications lawyers come back to me questioning whether I know what I'm talking about at this point. And they say, it's not out yet. And I said, well, that's probably because somebody is writing a rip-roaring dissent. So maybe it'll take a little bit longer, but there'll be a dissent and it'll be very interesting. Well, it turns out that it's you wait for this big, Christmas present that you think is coming, and it's getting more and more exciting. And then you get like a spatula, because what ended up coming out was a unanimous decision, about 50 pages long, but it had a lot to cover. But the second kind of more substantive and interesting part is, to me, that opinion, which I also commend to you, shows you a little bit about what the D.C. Circuit does with the limits of Chevron deference. Because at least in one respect, it applied what I sometimes think of as the "oh, please" doctrine. There was a regulation that the FCC put in place that basically said, if you have a device, oversimplifying a little bit, if you have a device that even has the potential to make a robocall or a robotext, you could be liable for civil penalties and privately enforced civil penalties under the TCPA, up to $500 an instance, with, I think, no cap. That, as was revealed at argument, includes all of our smartphones. So the opinion made the point that if the FCC's regulation is to be believed, all of us, if we send a group text to people who we may not know yet, are potential violators of the TCPA. So under the statute that the FCC was invoking to put that regulation in place, the D.C. Circuit didn't even really go into a significant Chevron colloquy. Its basic conclusion was, this can't possibly be what the statute permits. Go back and do it again. And so I think it shows you maybe what the extreme boundary is of Chevron deference, even by a panel that I think was led by Judge Edwards, he of the Federal Standards of Review. So it shows you a little bit about what those extremes look like.
Yeah, it was remarkable to see an opinion take that long to issue. So you can go back and tell your colleagues that I was surprised too. At the end of the year, by the end of the year being the summer, because that's how it works here, I guess, you get weeks in the D.C. Circuit where you get 15 opinions, and they're all long. I remember there was one last summer, 1 week, where I sit down to read these things, and it was 419 pages. And I'm like, whew. Because the goal is to get them all out before the clerks flip over and they start hearing cases again in September. And this one blew past that, and then we got just an ordinary opinion. So I don't know what happened there. People have asked, and your guess is as good as mine as to what happened, but your colleagues should know that you're not a liar.
And on that note, with the "I'm not a liar" hashtag, thank you, Cate and Aaron. We want to give a big round of applause to our guests. And a huge thank you to the Georgetown Federalist Society for inviting us for this live episode of Short Circuit. I'm Sheldon Gilbert, encouraging you without a thesaurus to get engaged.